Now, last week, time got away from us. I'm wearing a watch today, so we should stay on track. But now we've got 4 commandments to get through today. So we're just going to lightning our way through them. Any questions from last week after we took our time with those first 2 commandments? You shall not have any other gods but the Lord God, and you shall not make any graven images. Any questions? All right, does anyone know what the 3rd commandment is? What's number 3? Come on, extra heaven points.
Never take the Father's name in vain.
Okay, do not take the Lord's name in vain. Glad someone was paying attention in Sunday school.
She has a whole song she'd be happy to sing.
You shall not lift up the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Now, the question we have to ask is, how would one lift up the Lord's name in vain? How would you go about doing this? Swearing. What do you mean? Just saying bad words? Traffic. All right, swearing specifically with God's name, right? Okay. In which case, swearing or lifting up the name of the Lord in vain would be an issue of speech, right? I'm not sure that that's what this means. Now, I'm not sure that we should take the Lord's name, the word, lightly, but when we actually look into this commandment, I think that we're going to see that it's actually talking about something else. Because in order to figure out what's the wrong way to do it, we would have to ask, well, what's the right way? What is the right use of the Lord's name? What does it look like when it's not given in vain? Well, what's interesting is God says this to Moses in Exodus chapter 6. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but my name, the Lord, that's Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. But, and now here's the context. Why does God give his actual name? I have heard the groanings of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are holding as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. So go and say to the Israelites, I am, Yahweh is the Lord, and will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians and deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment, and I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. So what can we conclude then? Why does God reveal the divine name? If God for hundreds and hundreds of years had been faithful to this family and had made good his covenant with them, why now is the divine name being revealed? To free them from slavery. Because Moses said, they're going to ask, who is requiring that these people let go? And God said, okay. I've never told a human my name. I have never, ever given it and allowed it to be used. But now I'm going to do something different. I'm going to make my name known, and it's for the purpose of liberating the slaves, so that these will become my people. So this is God's language for what the divine name does. It liberates. It sets free. It brings life. So therefore, we can conclude that the rightful use of God's name is using it for that which brings life, that which brings freedom, that which makes this circle wider for who enjoys the benefit of living in God's good creation. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. So that all seems fine and good, but why does this not just mean speech, or even primarily? The Lord spoke to Moses, and you've all probably heard this. This is the Aaronic blessing, sometimes called the priestly benediction. And Aaron says, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Now notice what it says after that. And so they, the priests, shall put my name on the people. Think about the word lift up. You shall not lift up the Lord's name in vain. Another synonym for lift up is to bear. You shall not bear the Lord's name in vain. God has put the divine name on God's people. We bear God's name. So it's not necessarily about lifting it up with our voice, although, like I said, that is obviously included, but this includes all actions. You and I and we bear the name of Yahweh. Those of us in here bear the name of Jesus Christ. Now think about those original creation stories that we've been talking about and how this is connected to those creation stories. Think about when God creates people and says, let's make something in our own image, something in the likeness of the divine, and makes people. And then did you ever notice that then people are supposed to do the things that God had been doing? In the second creation story, God plants a garden. Well, after he makes the human in his image, guess what the human's job now is to do? To tend the garden. In the first creation story, when God speaks everything into existence, he says, all right, let's make humankind. And then he tells them, rule over nature. Make sure everything stays in its place. Make sure everything is protected. All that the humans are supposed to do is the responsibilities that God had been doing and that God entrusts to them. So what's interesting is, as God imparts the divine image on humans, humans receive some of God's responsibility. You were made in God's image, so now you also have some tasks that God does, like helping to keep creation sustained. So too, when we receive God's name, we are also receiving God's nature. God's people should look like God. So what's interesting is throughout the Hebrew Bible, we see things like this. You shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Molech. That's a foreign god. And so profane the name of God. Now here's what's interesting. I don't think they were using Yahweh's name in a ceremony where they were sacrificing their children to Molech. Pretty sure Yahweh's name would not have come up at all. It's a celebration and a sacrifice to another deity. But the action of sacrificing one's children, aren't you glad, is, two of those are mine, and one might as well be. It's the action that profanes the name of God. They're not speaking God's name here, but because God gives life and they're celebrating by taking life, that profanes the name of God. The Lord will establish you as his holy people, says Moses, as he has sworn to you. Now notice, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways, meaning walk as he does, do as he does, and all the peoples of the earth shall see that you are called by his name. How you bear the Lord's name is directly related to how do you walk and live and operate. Does it look like what God does or not? So by doing the kinds of actions and being the kind of people like the Egypt they were rescued from, people who exploit and enslave, people who kill, people who scheme against others, that profanes the name of God because God is the opposite of all those things. It's a little harder to follow this commandment if it's not just speech? You know how they say actions speak louder than words? I think maybe it was these kinds of scriptures that started inspiring that. And then, of course, there is the beautiful prayer in Psalm 86, teach me your way, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. Notice this constant pairing of walking, of what you do, of how you live, and give me an undivided heart to revere your name. So all of these things about God's name have something to do with what is our nature as a people, and how do we act. I just think that's so important. Because I doubt any of us here have ever been as offended by vulgar speech as we have been or should be by seeing children sacrificed on the altar of a God who is thirsty for blood. Let's just be honest. One is a little worse than the other. Any questions before we move on? Look, we are flying. Yes.
We've always looked at that as don't take the Lord's name in vain, or don't take God's name in vain. We use the name God as God primarily. You were doing the same thing. But right now you hear just repeatedly even the OMG. Oh my God. I mean, that's just, you'll hear it 5 times an hour on television, et cetera. Is that not taking the Lord's name in vain? You're using it without thinking?
Well, like I said, I'm sure that speaking God's name in ways that have nothing to do with God's self, I'm sure that is part of this. But I don't think that was the primary issue. I don't think that you can be a kind of person, or let's just say a kind of people, who doesn't care about the things God cares about, but the fact that you haven't ever said OMG, fully spelled out, means that, oh, I haven't broken this commandment. Like, I would say it would be the opposite. That's what I think. Does that make sense?
Not sure I follow you on that.
Okay, so what the problem, like, I'm not saying that we shouldn't speak God's name in vain, and I don't think that these people did either. I don't think that they thought we shouldn't speak God's name very carefully in what we attribute to God and things like that. But I don't think that it was ever meant to be speech exclusively, because otherwise you could have people, as long as you didn't speak God's name, you could sacrifice your kid to Molech and that wasn't profaning God's name? No, of course it is, because it's more to do with just speech.
You've got the other 9 commandments that aim at all those other things. And it seemed like this one is aimed at don't use the name in vain. I mean, that's the way we've translated it.
The word in Hebrew is lift up.
Okay.
So, which can mean literally lift up, or we also use the word bear.
Yeah, but like I said, for the most part, when you see it written, it'll talk about in vain. In vain means lightly. I mean, you're not thinking about it. You're just throwing it out.
It means empty is the best,
Yeah.
the best.
Yes. And it seemed like this particular commandment, is aimed at just don't, when you mention God's name, it ought to be really thinking about God.
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's my pet peeve that people throw this OMG around like nobody's business, and I don't know that they really know what they're doing when they do that.
I'm sure that would be frustrating, but I think from like this particular perspective, God would be like, his pet peeve is, how come these people have my name and they don't act anything like me? How come I'm a liberating God and there are people enslaved in the world and my people don't seem to care? That's God's pet peeve. That's the angle I think we're going at here. Any other questions?
I heard somewhere with the Jewish people.
Oh, sorry.
I heard at one time that the Jewish people could not even say the word God. They would have to leave out some of the
Yeah.
without a letter.
You'll see them write L and D and then put little dashes in between. And that
So-
was not commanded. That was one of those, let's build this out so we never ever even get close. Because here's the thing, if we don't say God's name, we can never say it wrongly. But I'm just not sure that that's what this was intended to do. Like, God's name, the way God gives it to Moses, is powerful, and God gives it to him so he can use it. Go and set these people free and use my name. I think that by us refusing to speak God's name and refusing to speak in God's name and bear God's name, I think there's lots of opportunities for salvation that we're not offering. I personally, and now, like I said, I understand why they do it, but personally, I feel like we're supposed to be using God's name, but it's very clear what we're supposed to be using it and bearing it for. So that would be my answer to that.
But there's so many people out there that do not know God.
Exactly.
And if you don't know the God that we know, it's just a byword to them.
And remember, this is always the really important part. This is the part we have to remember. The commandments are given to God's people. These are people God has covenanted with. God didn't command anybody else to observe these things. These are for God's people. So it makes total sense why people who have not encountered God and have not had a relationship with God, they haven't had the burning bush moment. Yes, that name wouldn't mean that to them. But these are given for us, for God's people to follow. And we, at least I think most of us, claim to have had that encounter, claim to have an ongoing encounter and revelation of who God is. So I feel like that's where this kind of stuff is not stuff we need to worry about other people following and observing, because that wasn't given to them. Now, they'll get it sooner or later, hopefully. These will be things that they will be able to know and learn, but you can't hold someone accountable to a covenant that they're not entered into. Yes?
I'll try to be quick, which is a challenge for me. But
We're making good time.
okay. This reminds me of a story that my 91-year-old father-in-law tells, and some of the people in this room know him. He is a junior, and when he was a young teenager, he was quite a handful, and he got involved in all sorts of things that were not good for him to get involved with, and skipping school and doing stuff. And so the principal calls and talks to his mom about this. And he comes home from the pool hall, and she says, "How was school today?" And he said, "Oh, it was great, Mom." You know, she's like, "No, you don't understand. I know where you've been. And Jimmy, there's something you need to know. You bear your father's name, and how you act reflects on him. And you need to think about that." And it was a turning point in his life to hear that and think about that. And I think sometimes we don't name all the time name our children, but naming people in the ancient world spoke something about their character. Mm-hmm. And if we don't uphold God's character by the way we live, we reflect poorly on God and on his name. And I just thought that was a neat little real life example of how that works and why that's important.
Can you drop that mic? Oh, it was a joke. It was a joke. Like, mic drop. That was an amazing example, and I might have to use that one with your permission at some point in the future, because I'm like, wow, that is really powerful. Absolutely. All right, great job, you guys. All right, on to commandment number 4. This one's super fun. I love talking about this one because I'm always surprised by this one. Look at the Exodus version. "Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and consecrated it. Okay, so how do you remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy? What are you supposed to do? Okay, rest, not work. What else? I don't see church on there anywhere. What else? Okay, and how do we know? Well, how do we keep it holy? How does it say we keep it holy?
Don't work.
No, it does say that, but how do we keep it holy? Besides that, besides don't work, what are you supposed to do? It means it's different, yes. You do rest. What else do you do? Liliana?
You let other people rest.
You give rest to other people. Sabbath is just as much about giving it as taking it. And in fact, you remember how I said I love Deuteronomy because it's like we get a commentary on Exodus, so it helps us figure out how they were thinking about it? Look at how much longer Deuteronomy is, and look at the difference. Look at the difference. So he says, observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you'll work, and the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female slave or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the resident alien in your towns. And then look at this addition. So that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. And then look at the reason for that. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, this is how you keep the Sabbath. Isn't that interesting? Isn't this interesting that the commandment to keep the Sabbath isn't just you refrain, but how do you make it so others can rest? How are you giving rest to those that may even be your slaves, your servants? In fact, you need to give rest to your animals. And the whole point is to take you back in your mind to, don't you remember what it was like? In fact, we get this great verse in Exodus that sets up what slavery looked like. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. Next week, Ryan will be with y'all, and he has a phrase that I love, and he says, you know, this whole wilderness time that the Israelites are wandering around, it's not so much, well, it's just as much getting Egypt out of them as it was getting them out of Egypt. Before we can get to the promised land and live as God's people in this amazing place flowing with milk and honey, we need to take a break and remember this wasn't good. Which is interesting because there'll always be this play that they'll say, oh, we should have gone back to Egypt. And I just hear Billy Joel saying, you know, the good old days weren't always good. Don't you remember? Do you remember when you were on the other side of that line? When you were the one being imposed on and you worked without rest? Again, this goes back to you've been given God's name. You've been given God's identity. You've been given God's likeness. You must have God's nature. And God's nature is giving rest to the weary. So much so that that would be Jesus' slogan in the Gospel of Matthew. Come to me and I will give you rest. Because we're talking about the same God. And then I love that after the 10 Commandments are given, there's this little exposition. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, so that your ox and donkey may have relief, and your homeborn slave and the resident alien may be refreshed. Now, this is what's interesting, because you remember the first week we talked about, Gabriel? You remember the first week when we were talking about the law code of Hammurabi? The ancient Babylonian code that looks a lot like some of these Old Testament laws. Do you know what's interesting is there's all these laws about murder and stealing and things like that. They're very similar. Do you know what the really big difference is? The law of Moses has repeated how you treat the foreigner, the stranger, the alien. That is not part of any of the other ancient law codes. That is unique to the Old Testament. That how you bear God's name and how you bear God's nature has to do with how do you treat someone who is a stranger in your country. And it goes back to this foundational Exodus story. Don't you remember what it was like being in a foreign land and being oppressed and being disregarded? You remember that, right? And that's why they're celebrating the Passover every year, is to remember these kinds of things. Do you remember not just how God redeemed you, but what God redeemed you from? And that ought to be some kind of a way that shapes your future and how you treat others. I find that so fascinating. Any questions? Oh, this is fun. What does Sabbath symbolize? Rest? Okay, but when we think about the seventh day, right, what does it symbolize? Okay, the reason that they're doing it on the seventh day is because of the creation story where God rests on the Sabbath. But the Sabbath itself in relation to the rest of the week is 1/7, okay? Think about things like tithing. How much is a tithe? 10%, okay? I would say, how much is a circumcision? I feel like that's on a case-by-case basis. I know I said I was going to cut out all the circumcision jokes, but I couldn't help myself. Think about it this way. How much of our money doesn't belong to God? Exactly. A tithe is rendering a part, 10%, that's meant to symbolize the whole. Giving God this part is actually a way of saying that it all belongs to God. Rendering a circumcision is a way of saying that giving this small part is giving, in a sense, the whole person. Because now this person is marked as being God's. The Sabbath is one day, but it's rendering apart this one day that really is also saying that all our time belongs to God. All that we do throughout the week. This isn't the one day where we honor God. This is the day that symbolizes giving this part that gestures to all the rest of it. And that's what I kind of love about that, is that rest can then permeate that whole week. The holiness of circumcision and of tithing, it's meant to permeate all the rest that we do. Tithing shouldn't just be like, all right, I give 10% to God, and then this 50% I do these terrible things with. No, the fact that we're rendering that 10% means that we have God in mind as we use the rest of it, right? So it's not a part, it's a part that symbolizes the whole. And so I always find that a really lovely and a great encouragement to, you can rest on Wednesday too. All right, we are just, shoot. Okay, now we finally made it to honor your father and mother. I am so glad you all are here. I'm thrilled. This is like my favorite verse for my kids to hear. Honor your father and mother so that your days may be long in the land that your God is giving you. And then notice how in Deuteronomy it gets longer. Like I said, in Deuteronomy they love to make sure, like, in case you didn't understand, we're going to add some clarification. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God commanded you. All y'all. So that your days may be long and it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, who do we usually think that this commandment is for? It's children. Oh, Why would you say the parents?
To show the children how they should honor.
I think you scored all the heaven points for tonight. There are no more left to give out in case anyone wants to know. Yes. And here's what's interesting is that I grew up thinking, oh, this is about kids, right? And their grown parents. But listen to this portion. There is a Jewish book in the, it's apocryphal, not apocryphal, it's, oh shoot. I just blanked on the word. Anyway, it is considered authoritative scripture for our Orthodox and our Catholic brethren and sistren. We don't have it in our Bibles, but the book of Sirach is a Jewish book from what we call the intertestamental time. And I want you to listen to this. I find this really, really interesting. Those who honor their father will have joy in their own children. My child, help your father in his old age, and do not grieve him as long as he lives. Even if his mind fails, be patient with him, because you have all your faculties, don't despise him. For kindness to a father will not be forgotten. So yes, your kids are watching you. As you're caring for your parents as they go into old age, your children are watching you. And you are showing them this is how we treat our parents. It's not just little kids obey your parents so that you won't die because your parent told you not to go into the road and then you got hit by a car, so if you die, it's your fault you didn't listen to your parents. This isn't so much about that as if you want to live long and have those years in the land actually be good that you're living, then you need to make sure you've built up your family system in such a way that will accommodate that. And I always find this really interesting because we're always preaching this scripture to kids. And yet I feel like for people my age, I'll be 43 next month, this is a conversation that my husband and I are having now about our parents, about, okay, what will it mean to be honoring and faithful to our parents when we're taking care of them or we're making decisions for them? That's a different conversation, and this is where I find that we often don't tap this part of Scripture that, yeah, the whole parent and kid stuff isn't just about little kids, isn't just about minors, but it's even, in fact, I think more important for this particular reason is that your kids are watching you. Any questions? All right. We're on the last one, y'all. We did it. All right, don't kill. I hope you're booing the murder. And okay, yeah. We don't want to kill. That's the whole point. Like, don't kill. All right, but I want you to notice when we read this commandment in light of so many other commandments. Like I said, those prohibitive commandments, like don't kill, mean more than just don't actually take someone else's life physically and literally. But look at some of the other commandments that are in the Old Testament. If you take your neighbor's cloak and pawn, you need to restore it before the sun goes down. It might be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover, and in what else will that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen because I am compassionate. So this means like you may have a right like to take your neighbor's cloak because you're repossessing it for a debt, or you're taking it in pawn because you've lent money. But guess what? This would be an area where you should relinquish your right, and you need to give it back right away because they have nothing else. And your compassion absolutely trumps your rights all the time in God's community. So think about, it's not just don't kill, but make sure you're looking out that your neighbor's life is protected. If any of your kin fall into difficulty and become dependent on you, you should support them. Boy, this is coming right on the heels of that parent and child thing. They shall live with you as though resident aliens. Do not take interests in advance or otherwise make a profit from them, but fear your God and let them live with you. It's really interesting that it says it'll be like resident aliens. I love that in the ancient world, one's social dignity totally rested on your ability to provide hospitality to a stranger. And people were obligated. If there is a stranger, if there is an alien, you need to make sure that you invite them in and you give them shelter and make sure they are cared for and safe. Because if anything happens to them, this is a disgrace to your community that a stranger would come and be harmed. But I think that's really interesting that it tells us, treat them like you would a stranger, which is interesting because I think maybe even then, we were a little better at treating strangers sometimes than we are treating members of our own community and families. And so make sure that you don't just give them a place to stay, but make them feel special, welcome. And that this is part of what it means not just to not kill, but to foster life. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof. Otherwise, you might have blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. You have to actually be thinking about these things ahead of time. What are the thoughts and decisions that I'm making with what I have, and how might those affect other people? Could they be harmed? Could someone get hurt? These are way bigger questions and way more attention that has to be paid to one's movement in the world than just simply not killing someone else. When you reap your harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf, don't go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what's left. It shall be left for the alien and the orphan and the widow. When you gather the grapes, don't glean what is left. And then look at what the reason for is at the bottom. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Right? So you want to think about that experience of what did it feel like to be on the bottom of the pile? What did it feel like to be the disposable people? What did it feel like to go without? Your whole role as the community of God that bears God's name and God's identity in the world is you need to be the opposite of people who take everything for themselves, but are always looking for, how can I give? Because that's what reflects God's nature. How can we give? How can we make sure everyone else is provided for and cared for? How do we make sure we prevent the loss of life, not just keep our hands clean from any kind of bloodshed ourselves? And that's, like I said, why I'm so grateful for the fact that we don't just have the 10 Commandments, we have all the commandments. And when we read them together like that and we start pulling those threads, what we start seeing is one leads into another, one makes a comment on another, and we start seeing this far more fulsome way of living. It's not just about these 10 Commandments. This is a whole big life, and it will take each individual life and the life of the community together to keep all these commandments as God truly intends for us to. Not just so I'm not guilty, but that so we're all actively participating in creating and sustaining life. That's why I'm grateful for it. And we have done amazing. So, any thoughts, questions, expressions of joy? Yes. Oh, sorry.
You're slow, but you're good. As I hear this, and as I've studied it myself, I think how wonderful. I mean, what a society we would have if everyone would live by the 10 Commandments. But then I think there would be no stand your ground laws, right? If you take this as your command. And where it falls apart for me is the promise of the promised land and taking the land from the people who live there. And it's still going on. And so I get the 10 Commandments and the intent that we work at to get it all. But I also see the contradiction of, like the promise of the land, go in and take it. And I see a twisting. You know, the covenant was given so that they would have this relationship, but also be a blessing
Yes.
for the whole world. And so that's some of the things I struggle with, is how to put it all together and to respect it. Those are just some thoughts that were percolating for me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is really good, and it's really helpful. Because I think all of us in here have read the Bible in some places and thought, well, how do we make sense of that in light of, like, I shouldn't even take in all of the harvest that I've worked for. But on the other hand, we've got conquest of people who never do me any wrong. That seems contradictory. I completely understand that. The thing that I find helpful, so when I'm reading these, I read from a literary point of view. So, we absolutely could read in a really wide historical point of view like that, but when we're reading the literary text, what we're looking at is, what were they writing in order for us to see? Like, and while we can absolutely say, like, historically, in this context of all of these different books of the Bible, there are some really big problems with the way they communicate. But I'll never forget, I was reading the book of Judges. It was my Hebrew 3 class in seminary. And there's this great part where the Israelites are being attacked by this foreign, army. And the story switches to the perspective of the foreign army. And I'm reading this in Hebrew. And I just thought, why are the Moabites speaking Hebrew? And my Hebrew Bible professor said, everybody speaks Hebrew in a Hebrew story. So who are we meant to identify with? We're definitely meant to identify with the people that these commandments have been given to. Now, the balance of this is that we also, as Christians, we have been given Jesus. And so while we definitely see God as deity here in the Old Testament, when we look at what role we should follow, we look and say, Jesus is the expression of God fully revealed that we are meant to follow. We do not need to replicate anything that the God of the Old Testament as a deity did. We don't need to command holy wars. We don't need to kill people for touching an ark. That's not our job. Our model to follow is what was given to us. What does God look like as a human being? And that's Jesus Christ. And so that's how I make peace with that, is what am I intended to receive here? And then what am I meant to identify with? And then how do I reconcile these stories through the lens of the person of Jesus Christ? And is it messy? Yeah. But honestly, the best thing is just naming it, saying those things out loud. Hey, there's some really messy stuff here that I don't know how we can get around, and I don't know that we were even meant to get around it. But maybe just to say, yeah, that's stuff in the Bible, and we shouldn't do that. We should not go in and take people's land that doesn't belong to us. What's wrong with that? Well, we're not going to do that. Also, it says that if your kids aren't listening, you can take them out and stone them. Aren't you glad we don't do that either? Anyway, they're such good sports. Any other thoughts? Comments? Yes, ma'am. Patience is one of the fruits of the Spirit.
In the New Testament, we have 2 commandments I given to you. Love your God, love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first greatest. So does that negate the Old Testament?
No, in fact, Matthew says that actually summarizes it. Or it summarizes the part we're meant to get. Like we talked about, there are some parts that we're like, I don't know that we can make that work. I realize it's doing something else in that story. In that story, it is meant to do this thing, But just because it's doing that thing in that story doesn't mean we need to replicate it here in ours. And yes, loving the Lord your God with all your heart and loving your neighbor as yourself, if you do those things, you will do all these things. In fact, Paul summarizes it, was it Galatians, where he just says, love does no harm. There, that summarizes the law too. So, I mean, there are lots of different ways of doing that. And yes, we're not throwing the Old Testament out. We're just synthesizing it. Any other thoughts? All right, well, y'all have fun with Ryan next week.